In the autumn of 52 BC, according to Julius Caesar's own battlefield dispatches, 50,000 Roman soldiers built a cage around themselves. 40 kilometers of walls, ditches filled with water, and concealed death traps. Not to keep an enemy out, but to keep themselves in. Contemporary Roman records document what happened next. 100,000 warriors arrived to crush Caesar's trapped legions. The Romans didn't retreat. They added a second wall facing outward and prepared to fight on two fronts simultaneously. Think about those numbers. 50,000 Romans, 80,000 Gauls trapped inside the fortifications, 100,000 to 250,000 in the relief army outside. Ancient sources vary, but even conservative modern estimates put it at 100,000. By any calculation, Caesar was outnumbered at least 3 to 1, possibly 5 to 1. These figures come from multiple sources: Caesar's own account, later Roman historians, and archaeological evidence that confirms the scale. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented engineering and discipline defeated impossible odds in what became the textbook example of siege warfare for the next 2,000 years. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that changed European history. First, the automated killing system Caesar's engineers built, confirmed by archaeology, that turned terrain into a weapon needing no soldiers to operate. Second, why 60,000 elite Gallic warriors attacking from high ground against 3,000 Romans still lost, a tactical reversal documented in precise detail. Third, what happened to the civilians caught between these armies, a tragedy so brutal that even Caesar's propaganda machine struggled to justify it. But here's what makes this siege historically unprecedented. How did Caesar convince his soldiers to trap themselves between two massive armies? What made him think engineering could overcome a 5 to 1 numerical disadvantage? Why did the Gallic relief force, with overwhelming numbers, fail to break a 40-kilometer perimeter? How did Roman discipline hold when commanders had to defend walls they couldn't even see across? And why did enemy sources themselves, written centuries later, still describe this as an engineering miracle? To understand how Caesar turned military logic upside down, we need to go back 8 years to when a debt-ridden Roman politician gambled everything on a war of conquest that would either make him Rome's master or destroy him completely. Ancient sources record a financial situation so desperate it bordered on catastrophic. Julius Caesar, at age 41, owed approximately 25 million denarii, a figure that Plutarch and Suetonius both document. Though modern historians suspect some exaggeration, even if inflated, the debt was certainly massive enough to threaten everything. This wasn't the comfortable borrowing of a wealthy aristocrat. This was political survival debt, accumulated through bribing voters, funding lavish games, and purchasing influence in a system where money bought power and power required money. The mathematics were brutal. Caesar's creditors were circling. His political enemies, led by the conservative senator Marcus Porcius Cato, were sharpening their legal knives. The moment Caesar's consulship ended in 59 BC, he would lose his legal immunity. Prosecution would follow. Conviction meant exile at best, execution at worst. Not for crimes. Roman politics didn't need actual crimes. They needed enemies and opportunity. But Caesar had secured something his enemies couldn't touch while he held it: a 5-year proconsular command over 3 provinces: Cisalpine Gaul in northern Italy, Transalpine Gaul in southern France, Illyricum along the Adriatic coast. The governorship brought legal immunity that extended as long as he held military command. More importantly, it brought opportunity. Gaul meant wealth, plunder, slaves, tribute, and Gaul meant glory, military victories that could transform a debt-ridden politician into a conquering hero. In 58 BC, opportunity arrived, wearing the face of necessity. The Helvetii, a Celtic tribe from what's now Switzerland, began migrating westward. Caesar's own account records their numbers at 368,000 people, including women and children, a figure modern historians view skeptically, but which certainly represented a massive population movement. They wanted to cross through Roman territory to reach the Atlantic coast. Caesar saw his chance. He presented the migration as a threat to Rome's Gallic allies and the security of Roman provinces. The Senate, always eager to expand Roman power, gave him authorization to respond. What followed wasn't defense. It was systematic conquest. Caesar didn't just stop the Helvetii migration. He defeated them, killed thousands, and sent the survivors back to their burned homeland. Then he kept going. Within months, he was campaigning against Germanic tribes east of the Rhine. By 57 BC, he was conquering the Belgic tribes in northern Gaul. By 56 BC, he had launched naval campaigns against the Atlantic coast. Each victory brought wealth pouring into Roman coffers and Caesar's personal treasury. Each campaign created more battle-hardened veterans personally loyal to the general, who led them to victory and shared the plunder generously. The debt that had threatened to destroy him was disappearing under mountains of Gallic gold and hundreds of thousands of enslaved captives sold at Roman markets. The political enemies who had waited to prosecute him were forced to watch his popularity soar in Rome as his dispatches arrived describing victory after victory. Caesar was transforming himself from a desperate debtor into the most successful Roman general since Pompey. But debt and political fear don't explain military genius. By 52 BC, Caesar commanded an army that could march 25 miles a day, build fortified camps every night, and construct bridges across major rivers in days. His legions didn't just fight, they engineered. Every soldier carried entrenching tools and knew how to use them. This combination of combat skill and construction capability would become crucial at a place called Alesia, where Caesar would attempt something no Roman general had dared before. Everything was working perfectly, until a young Gallic aristocrat did what no one thought possible. He united the fractious Celtic tribes against Rome. Caesar's account in his Gallic war commentaries introduces Vercingetorix with a detail that reveals everything about Gallic politics. His father, Celtillus, had been chief of the Arverni tribe until his own people executed him for seeking kingship. The Gauls violently opposed monarchy. Their tribal system relied on elected magistrates and councils of nobles. Chiefs served at the pleasure of the aristocracy. Anyone who tried to concentrate too much power faced the same fate as Celtillus. Yet in the winter of 53 to 52 BC, Celtillus's son was pursuing exactly the path that had gotten his father killed. Vercingetorix was young. Caesar describes him as such, suggesting late 20s or early 30s at most. He was ambitious, charismatic, and possessed of a vision that terrified the Arvernian elders who remembered his father's dangerous dreams. When Vercingetorix began organizing armed supporters in the countryside, his uncle and the tribal magistrates moved quickly. They expelled him from Gergovia, the hilltop capital of the Arverni, hoping to end the threat before it grew. They had just made their greatest mistake. Instead of crushing Vercingetorix's movement, the exile gave him exactly what he needed: the mantle of oppressed rebel against a corrupt establishment. He raised an army among rural Arverni warriors tired of Roman demands for grain, tribute, and hostages. In early 52 BC, he marched on Gergovia with enough force that the city's defenders chose not to resist. The young outcast seized his tribe's capital and stood before a council of Gallic tribes as something unprecedented. A war leader asking for supreme command over a pan-Gallic confederation. Historical sources document what happened next with a mixture of Roman surprise and grudging respect. Tribe after tribe submitted to Vercingetorix's authority. The Senones, the Parisi, the Pictones, the Cadurci, even the Aedui, Rome's oldest and most reliable Gallic allies, would eventually defect to his cause. This wasn't just military alliance. This was political revolution. For the first time in documented Celtic history, multiple tribes were submitting to a single war leader with the authority to command their warriors, control their resources, and direct their strategy. Caesar himself provides evidence of how extraordinary this achievement was. His earlier books describe Gallic tribes constantly at war with each other, shifting alliances based on ancient grudges and immediate advantage. He had conquered Gaul partly by exploiting these divisions, playing tribes against each other, rewarding allies, and crushing resistors. The idea that these fractious peoples could unite under one commander had seemed impossible. Vercingetorix made it real. But unity alone wouldn't defeat Rome. The young Arvernian commander understood something that would prove him a strategic thinker far beyond most of his contemporaries. He recognized that Roman legions were heavy infantry dependent on local food supplies. They couldn't carry enough grain for sustained campaigns. They relied on requisitions from conquered territories and foraging by detachments of soldiers. Cut off their food, and even Caesar's legendary legions would starve. What Vercingetorix proposed to his confederation shocked even his own supporters. He would burn Gallic towns, villages, and granaries. Everything that could feed Roman armies would be destroyed. The Gauls would sacrifice their own civilization to deny supplies to the invaders. It was a strategy of total commitment. Scorched earth on a scale that demonstrated both tactical brilliance and ruthless determination. The tribes agreed. Within weeks, smoke rose from burning settlements across central Gaul. Vercingetorix was willing to destroy the land to save it from permanent conquest. By spring of 52 BC, the young man who shouldn't have been able to unite even his own tribe commanded the largest Gallic army in memory and was implementing a strategy that put Caesar on the defensive for the first time in 8 years of conquest. The general who had built a career on aggressive offensive warfare suddenly found his legions struggling to feed themselves while facing an enemy that refused pitched battle and melted away into the countryside after each skirmish. The impossible had happened. But Vercingetorix's greatest test was still ahead, and his next decision would determine whether this young king who shouldn't exist would become the liberator of Gaul or the architect of its final defeat. Contemporary records document the scale of destruction with numbers that still shock. More than 20 Gallic towns deliberately burned by Vercingetorix's order in the span of a single day. Caesar's account describes seeing smoke rising from multiple directions as the Confederation executed its strategy with ruthless efficiency. Villages? Grain stores? Anything that could sustain Roman troops, consumed by flames set by Gallic hands. The strategic logic was sound. Roman legions in Gaul numbered approximately 50,000 men by this point in the campaign. Each soldier required roughly 3 pounds of grain per day. Basic mathematics meant the army needed 75 tons of food daily just to survive. Caesar's supply lines stretched back to southern Gaul and across the Alps to Italy. But he had always supplemented these with local requisitions. Gallic granaries, Gallic livestock, Gallic grain fields. These had fed his conquering legions as they marched through the countryside. Vercingetorix was cutting that lifeline. The scorched earth policy created immediate pressure on Caesar's logistics. His foraging parties, sent out to gather supplies, returned empty-handed or were ambushed by Gallic cavalry. Roman soldiers went on reduced rations. The spring campaign season had barely begun, and Caesar's army was already struggling with supply problems that would only worsen as summer approached and existing stores were depleted. But the strategy demanded sacrifice from the Gauls themselves that tested even the most committed tribesmen. These weren't Roman settlements being burned. These were Gallic homes, Gallic food stores. Gallic wealth accumulated over generations. The peasants watched their winter grain go up in smoke. Craftsmen saw their workshops destroyed. Tribal leaders approved the burning of towns their ancestors had built. The psychological cost was immense. Vercingetorix was asking his people to destroy their own civilization in the hope of saving it from permanent Roman occupation. The Confederation held together through sheer determination and the young commander's forceful personality. But at Avaricum, modern Bourges, political reality collided with military necessity. The Bituriges tribe, whose territory contained this wealthy oppidum, pleaded with Vercingetorix to spare their capital. The town was prosperous, well fortified, and a source of tribal pride. Burning it would be an admission that nowhere was safe. That total scorched earth meant exactly that. Total. Vercingetorix faced a crisis of command. Pushed too hard for complete destruction, and the Confederation might fracture. Some tribes might decide that submission to Rome was preferable to watching their own civilization burn. Military logic said destroy Avaricum. Political reality said make exceptions to hold the alliance together. Vercingetorix chose politics. The town would be defended, not burned. Caesar's siege of Avaricum lasted 25 days. His engineers built siege ramps, artillery towers, and assault bridges, while the defenders fought from the walls with desperate courage. When the fortifications finally broke, Caesar records what followed with matter-of-fact brutality. Of approximately 40,000 people in the town, fewer than 800 survived. The legions had been on reduced rations and near mutinous. Caesar let them take out their frustrations on the civilian population. The massacre proved Vercingetorix's strategic judgment correct, and his political compromise disastrous. Modern historians debate the exact death toll. Caesar's numbers may be exaggerated for dramatic effect, but archaeological evidence confirms large-scale destruction and mass death. The survivors who reached Vercingetorix's camp told stories that hardened tribal resolve. There would be no more exceptions. If captured, Gallic settlements would be erased. Better to burn them first than let Roman legions do it with Gallic blood as kindling. But Vercingetorix needed a victory to restore confidence after Avaricum's fall. He needed to prove that Gallic forces could defeat Roman legions in battle. He found his opportunity at his own tribal capital, where the same hilltop position that had made Gergovia easy to capture from the Arvernian elders would make it nearly impossible for Caesar to take by assault. For the first time in 8 years of Gallic warfare, Julius Caesar was about to taste defeat. Gergovia sat on a plateau in the heart of Arverni territory, its natural defenses so formidable that Caesar's usual tactics, rapid assault, aggressive engineering, overwhelming force, couldn't overcome basic geography. The approaches were steep enough that armored infantry climbing them would be exhausted before reaching the defenses. Vercingetorix's warriors held the high ground with clear sight lines for missile fire. Any assault would involve Roman legionaries climbing slopes while Gallic javelins and slings targeted them from above. Caesar's account of the Gergovia campaign reveals tactical frustration unusual in his typically confident commentaries. He tried multiple approaches, Engineering works to gain higher ground, feints to draw out defenders, attempts to cut off water supplies. Nothing worked. Vercingetorix had learned from earlier defeats. He kept his force concentrated, refused to be drawn into disadvantageous combat, and used the terrain as his primary weapon. In late May of 52 BC, Caesar ordered an assault. The exact tactical details remain debated by military historians, but the outcome is documented with unusual specificity for ancient battle casualty figures. 700 Roman soldiers were killed, including 46 centurions. Those officer casualties were devastating. Centurions were the backbone of legion leadership, experienced veterans who maintained discipline, tactical cohesion, and battlefield morale. Losing 46 in a single engagement meant losing institutional knowledge that couldn't be quickly replaced. The assault failed completely. Roman forces retreated down the slopes they had charged up, leaving their dead behind, a humiliation that Caesar's army hadn't experienced in Gaul before. For the first time in 8 years of campaign, Roman legions withdrew from a battlefield in defeat. Caesar tried to minimize the disaster in his commentaries, blaming confusion and soldiers advancing beyond orders. But the facts spoke clearly enough. Vercingetorix had successfully defended Gergovia against the greatest general of the age. The political consequences rippled immediately. The Aedui, Rome's oldest and most valuable Gallic allies, had been wavering since Vercingetorix's rise. They had provided cavalry and supplies to Caesar throughout the conquest, their alliance stretching back decades. But Gergovia demonstrated Roman vulnerability. If Caesar could be defeated, perhaps the conquest wasn't inevitable. Perhaps the Gauls could actually expel the invaders. Contemporary sources document the Aedui's defection with details suggesting careful planning rather than impulsive decision. Their cavalry units serving with Caesar's army suddenly withdrew. Their chieftains sent messages to the Confederation offering alliance. Some Aeduan forces actively joined Vercingetorix's growing army. The defection was both symbolic and strategic. Losing the Aedui meant losing legitimacy among Gallic tribes and losing practical support that had sustained Roman campaigns. Caesar faced a genuine crisis. His army had been bloodied. His longest-standing allies had switched sides. Vercingetorix's confederation was growing stronger, while Roman logistics grew weaker under continued scorched earth pressure. Some of Caesar's officers reportedly suggested withdrawing to the Roman province in southern Gaul to regroup. The conquest of Gaul appeared to be unraveling. But Caesar had one advantage that Vercingetorix couldn't match: Germanic cavalry. Throughout the Gallic Wars, Caesar had recruited auxiliary horsemen from Germanic tribes east of the Rhine. These warriors fought differently than Gallic cavalry. They used heavier horses, fought in disciplined formations, and employed shock tactics, massed charges at full gallop designed to break enemy lines through sheer impact. Gallic cavalry, by contrast, traditionally fought as skirmishers, using mobility and missile weapons rather than close combat. In late June or early July, Caesar doesn't provide exact dates. The two armies' cavalry forces clashed in a major engagement near the Vingian River. The battle's details come almost entirely from Caesar's account, but the outcome is verified by what followed. The Germanic cavalry, despite being outnumbered, broke the Gallic cavalry formation with a decisive charge. The rout was complete. Vercingetorix's mobile force, which had been screening his infantry and maintaining intelligence about Roman movements, was shattered. Losing the cavalry forced Vercingetorix to change strategy entirely. Without mounted scouts and mobile warriors, he couldn't maintain the maneuver warfare that had frustrated Caesar since spring. He needed a strong defensive position where his infantry could wait while a relief army was raised from across Gaul. He needed somewhere that geography made impregnable, where 80,000 warriors could hold out long enough for the Confederation to mobilize its full strength. He chose Alesia, and in choosing the hilltop fortress that seemed impossible to assault, he made the decision that would seal his fate and determine the future of Gaul for 500 years. Caesar's engineers looked at the plateau of Mont Auxois and calculated what should have been impossible. Archaeological surveys confirmed the topography exactly as Caesar described it. A plateau approximately 2.5 kilometers long, rising 150 meters above the surrounding valleys. The Oise River to the north, the Oserain River to the south. Steep slopes on all approaches. Vercingetorix had positioned 80,000 warriors on terrain that made direct assault suicidal. Any conventional commander would have attempted negotiation or siege by blockade, sitting at a distance and waiting for starvation to force surrender. Caesar looked at the same situation and saw something different. He saw an opportunity to trap not just Vercingetorix's army, but the entire Gallic resistance. He saw a chance to end the war in a single, massive engagement. But first, he had to build something unprecedented. The measurement that emerges from Caesar's commentaries and has been confirmed by modern archaeology is staggering. 40 kilometers of fortification, not a single wall. 2 complete circuits of walls, ditches, and obstacles. The first ring, the contravallation, facing inward toward Alesia. Approximately 18 kilometers encircling the plateau to trap Vercingetorix's force. The second ring, the circumvallation, facing outward. Approximately 23 kilometers to protect the Romans from the relief army Caesar knew would eventually arrive. Military historians still debate whether this was brilliant strategy or desperate gamble. Caesar was deliberately boxing himself in. Once construction was complete, there would be no retreat. The Roman army would be caught between Vercingetorix's 80,000 warriors and however many hundreds of thousands the Gallic Confederation could raise. If the fortifications failed at any point, the entire Roman force would be destroyed. But Caesar understood something about his legions that made the gamble calculable. Every Roman soldier was trained not just in combat, but in engineering. They carried entrenching tools, dolabras, spades, baskets for moving earth. They knew how to survey land, calculate angles, build to specifications. In Caesar's army, there was no distinction between combat troops and construction workers. The same men who fought in formation spent their evenings digging ditches and raising ramparts. The construction specifications documented in Caesar's account have been verified with remarkable precision by excavations at Alesia Saint-Reine, the modern site confirmed as ancient Alesia. The ditches were V-shaped, 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep. The ramparts rose 12 feet high, made of earth reinforced with timber. Wooden palisades topped the ramparts. Watchtowers were positioned every 80 feet along the entire circuit. Modern archaeology has confirmed this exact spacing through tower foundation remains. The labor calculations are staggering. Modern engineering analysis estimates the legionaries moved between 1.2 and 1.5 million cubic meters of earth. They felled thousands of trees from the surrounding forests. They excavated miles of ditches. They built approximately 300 watchtowers, all while under constant harassment from Gallic cavalry and skirmishers trying to disrupt the work. Contemporary sources don't record the exact construction timeline, but based on the scale of work and standard Roman engineering practices, historians estimate 4 to 5 weeks of continuous labor. That means 50,000 men working in rotating shifts, some digging while others stood guard. Around-the-clock construction that transformed the landscape from farmland and forest into the largest military fortification complex of the ancient world. Vercingetorix's warriors watched from the heights of Mont Auxois as the Roman cage rose around them. They could see the fortifications taking shape. They could observe Roman engineers surveying sight lines for artillery. They could count the watchtowers multiplying along the circuit. Caesar's construction project was visible from the plateau, a deliberate psychological weapon. The defenders could watch their trap being built, but couldn't stop it. On the first night after Caesar's forces arrived, Vercingetorix made a critical decision documented in ancient sources. He sent his entire cavalry force, thousands of mounted warriors, out through gaps in the incomplete Roman fortifications under cover of darkness. The horses couldn't be fed during a prolonged siege. More importantly, the cavalry had a mission. Return to your tribes, raise every warrior who can fight, and bring them to Alesia within 30 days. That 30-day deadline wasn't arbitrary. Caesar records that Vercingetorix calculated his grain supplies carefully. 80,000 men eating strict rations could survive for 30 days. After that, starvation. Everything now depended on whether the relief army could arrive in time, and whether Caesar's engineering could withstand an assault from both sides simultaneously. Within 2 weeks, the contravallation was complete. Vercingetorix was trapped. Within 4 weeks, the circumvallation was finished. Caesar had trapped himself. The siege of Alesia had entered its strangest phase. Both sides locked in position, waiting for the relief army that would determine everything. But Caesar's engineers weren't finished building. Between the walls and the Gallic positions, they were creating something that ancient writers struggled to describe, and modern archaeology has confirmed in detail. They were building an automated killing field that would slaughter men who couldn't even see what killed them. In the 1990s, French and German archaeologists excavating at Alesia discovered something that made them recalculate everything they thought they knew about Roman military engineering. They found pits arranged in a perfect quincunx pattern, 5 dots like on dice, exactly as Caesar had described them 2,000 years earlier. The pits were 3 feet deep. At the bottom of each pit, charred remains of fire-hardened wooden stakes. The archaeological evidence matched Caesar's written account with precision that bordered on uncanny. Caesar called them lilia, lilies, because of how they looked when uncovered. His soldiers who built them had a darker sense of humor than the name suggests. Each pit was carefully concealed with twigs and brush. To an advancing warrior, the ground looked solid. The first indication something was wrong came when your foot went through the camouflage and impaled itself on a stake protruding 4 inches from the pit bottom. Contemporary sources record that many warriors were impaled on these obstacles. The archaeological evidence shows why. The stakes were the thickness of a man's thigh, sharpened to points, then fire-hardened to create wood as tough as iron. But the lilies were only one layer of Caesar's automated defense system. The archaeological record confirms 2 additional obstacle types, both exactly as described in ancient sources. The Sippi, boundary stones, were trenches 5 rows deep, filled with tree trunks and thick branches sharpened at the ends. The trunks were interlocked so thoroughly that pulling one out was impossible. The only way through was climbing over, which meant exposing yourself to Roman artillery fire while tangled in sharpened branches. The third obstacle type, the stimuli or goads, were perhaps the most psychologically devastating. Wooden blocks embedded with iron hooks were buried completely in the ground, scattered across the approach zones to the Roman fortifications. Unlike the lilies, which were at least visible once you fell into one, the stimuli were completely invisible. A warrior's first indication was an iron hook piercing through his sandal into his foot. The hooks were angled to cause maximum damage, and the wounds they inflicted became infected easily. Even minor foot wounds could disable a warrior, and the psychological effect of walking across ground where any step might impale you was immense. Modern military analysts recognize these obstacles as force multipliers, defensive systems that increase combat power without requiring additional soldiers. A properly designed obstacle zone means fewer defenders can hold more ground because the obstacles slow attackers, channel them into killing zones, and create casualties without Roman soldiers having to engage directly. Caesar's three-layer system of stimuli, lilies, and Scipi turned the approach to his fortifications into a zone where advancing meant accepting casualties before you even reached enemy soldiers. The archaeological confirmation of Caesar's account is historically significant beyond the battle itself. Ancient military narratives are notoriously unreliable. Commanders exaggerated victories, minimized defeats, inflated enemy numbers, and invented tactical details to make their accounts more dramatic. That excavators found Caesar's obstacle descriptions accurate to within inches 2,000 years later suggests his engineering specifications, at least, were documented with genuine precision. The excavations at Alesia revealed one more detail that brings the ancient battle into sharp focus. The lily pits contained remains of human bone fragments and iron arrowheads. The stimuli zones had corroded iron hooks still embedded in the soil. The Scipi trenches preserved the decayed remnants of interlocked timber. These weren't just theoretical defenses described in an ancient text. These were actual killing tools that had been used exactly as designed, and the physical evidence of their effectiveness remained in the ground. Inside Alesia, 80,000 warriors watched these obstacles being installed. They saw Roman soldiers working in shifts, digging pits, sharpening stakes, burying hooks. They understood perfectly well what was being built. A death maze designed to break men's bodies and minds before they ever reached the Roman walls. And they were counting the days until their food ran out. By day 28, the grain stores inside Alesia were nearly depleted. By day 30, they were gone. And the relief army still hadn't appeared on the horizon. Vercingetorix convened a council of war where the proposals ranged from desperate to horrifying. Caesar's account provides the specific calculation that drove all subsequent decisions inside Alesia. Vercingetorix assembled his commanders and presented them with simple mathematics. 80,000 warriors, existing grain supplies, strict rationing. Result: 30 days until starvation. The cavalry had been sent out on day 1 with orders to return with a relief army within that deadline. Everything now depended on whether the tribes could mobilize fast enough. Historical sources document the psychological pressure inside the besieged oppidum through the actions that desperation produced. The height of Mont Auxois provided clear sight lines to the Roman construction work below. Defenders could watch the fortifications rising, the obstacles being installed, the watchtowers multiplying. They could see exactly how thoroughly they were being trapped, but they were powerless to prevent it. Daily skirmishes occurred when Gallic warriors attempted to disrupt Roman work parties, but Caesar's forces maintained security through overwhelming local numbers at construction sites. As the days passed, the reality of their situation became clearer. The Romans weren't preparing for a quick assault. The scale of fortifications suggested Caesar planned to starve them out completely. The food countdown that had seemed theoretical on day 1 became urgent by day 15 and critical by day 25. Rationing grew stricter. Meals that had been adequate became sparse. Warriors began showing signs of reduced energy. The horses that remained inside Alesia, not all cavalry had been sent out, were consuming grain the infantry needed. On day 30, according to Caesar's timeline, the grain supplies were exhausted. Vercingetorix faced a decision point that had no good options. Surrender meant enslavement for his entire force. 80,000 warriors sold as slaves. The military power of the Confederation destroyed. Gallic resistance ended. A breakout attempt meant attacking the Roman fortifications with weakened, hungry troops against fresh, well-fed legionaries behind prepared defenses. Waiting meant slow death by starvation. The council of war that followed produced proposals that revealed the desperation inside Alesia. Some chieftains argued for immediate surrender, believing that Roman clemency might spare at least some warriors. Others advocated for a mass breakout. Better to die fighting than starving. But the proposal that Caesar records in greatest detail came from an Arvernian noble named Critognatus, and it demonstrates how far the defenders had been pushed. Critognatus, according to Caesar's account, delivered a speech arguing that the warriors should follow the example of their ancestors during the Cimbrian Wars decades earlier. When besieged and starving, the ancients had sustained their fighters by consuming those who were unfit for war, the elderly, women, children. It was, Critognatus argued, preferable to such extreme measures than to surrender to Roman slavery. Caesar includes this speech in his commentaries at length, clearly intending to portray Gallic desperation and what Romans would consider barbarity. Whether Critognatus actually delivered such a speech, or whether Caesar invented it for propaganda purposes, modern historians debate. What's certain is that the proposal he describes was rejected. The Gallic warriors didn't resort to cannibalism, but they did make a different, desperate choice that Caesar documents, without the lengthy moral commentary he gave Critognatus's proposal. The Mandubii were the native inhabitants of Alesia, the local tribe whose oppidum Vercingetorix had chosen for his stand. They numbered several thousand civilians, men too old to fight, women, children. They were consuming food that the warriors needed. Vercingetorix's council made a brutal calculation. Expel the Mandubii from Alesia. Send them toward the Roman lines. The civilians could offer themselves as slaves, standard practice in Roman warfare. Caesar would accept them. The useless mouths would be gone, and the warriors' food supply would last a few days longer, perhaps long enough for the relief army to arrive. Historical sources record what happened next with varying degrees of detail, but all agree on the essential facts. The Mandubii, women holding children, elderly struggling to walk, families carrying whatever possessions they could, were driven from Alesia at sword point by the same warriors who had defended them. They walked down from Mont Auxois and approached the Roman contravallation. They begged for mercy. They offered themselves as slaves. They pleaded to be allowed through the fortifications. Caesar refused. His reasoning, which he doesn't state explicitly, but which military historians infer from the tactical situation, was coldly logical. Every ounce of food the Mandubii received would be food denied to Vercingetorix's warriors. Accepting the civilians as slaves would reduce pressure on the defenders. Denying them passage maintained maximum pressure, forcing Vercingetorix to choose between bringing them back inside Alesia and sharing the already inadequate food, or letting them die. The Mandubii were trapped in no man's land between the Gallic walls of Alesia and the Roman contravallation. Neither side gave them food. Neither side gave them water. Caesar's account is brief to the point of coldness. They remained there and died. How long this took, how many died, what happened to any who survived, the historical record doesn't preserve those details. What it does preserve is this. By any modern definition, both sides committed what would be classified as a war crime. The Gauls expelled civilians from protection. The Romans refused mercy to non-combatants. By ancient standards, this was standard siege warfare. Civilians were military assets or liabilities depending on food supply. Modern moral judgments, while valid, must recognize that the ancient Mediterranean world operated under different rules of war. Rules where starvation of civilian populations was an accepted tactic. Inside Alesia, the warriors watched the Mandubii die and understood that no mercy would be shown if the relief army failed to arrive. Outside the Roman fortifications, on the hills to the west, something was finally appearing on the horizon. An army was approaching. The largest army Gaul had ever assembled was about to reach Alesia, and both the besieged and the besiegers prepared for the collision that would determine the future of Europe. Contemporary sources provide remarkable detail about the relief army's composition, and archaeological evidence confirms the historical accounts with unexpected precision. At Bibracta, the capital of the Aedui tribe, a pan-Gallic council convened to organize the rescue of Vercingetorix. Caesar's intelligence reports document, and later excavations have verified, that the council made a sophisticated logistical decision. They did not call up every warrior in Gaul. Instead, they assigned specific quotas to each tribe. The tribal breakdown that Caesar records is specific enough to suggest genuine intelligence rather than propaganda fabrication. The Aedui and their client tribes were assessed 35,000 warriors. The Arverni and their clients, another 35,000. The Sequani, Senones, Bituriges, Santoni, Rutini, and Carnutes, 12,000 each. Smaller tribes contributed proportionally. The Bellovaci sent 2,000 despite being assessed 10,000, claiming they wanted to fight Rome independently. The Helvetii, Suessiones, Ambiani, and others added thousands more. Caesar's total comes to 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Modern historians view this number with considerable skepticism. Feeding an army of that size would have been logistically impossible in a countryside that Vercingetorix had already scorched. Medieval armies with superior supply systems rarely exceeded 50,000 men. Conservative scholarly estimates place the relief force at 100,000 to 150,000 warriors. Still, a massive by ancient standards, still overwhelming numerical superiority over Caesar's 50,000 Romans, but more plausible given logistical realities. The archaeological confirmation comes from an unexpected source: coins. Excavations at Alesia have recovered hundreds of Gallic coins from nearly every tribe that Caesar lists in his account. The Aedui are represented, the Arverni, the Sequani, the Helvetii. The numismatic evidence proves that warriors from across Gaul did converge on Alesia, exactly as the ancient sources claim. The confederation that Vercingetorix had built was real, and it had mobilized its full military strength. The relief army's command structure reflected the political complexity of the confederation. 4 commanders were appointed by the tribal council: Commius of the Atrebates, Viridomarus and Eporidorix of the Aedui, and Vercassivellaunus of the Arverni, Vercingetorix's own cousin. Divided command was a political necessity. No single tribe would accept another tribe's general as supreme commander. But divided command created coordination problems that would prove critical in the coming battle. The decision to limit the levy rather than call up every available warrior shows sophisticated strategic thinking. The Gallic leaders recognized that an army too large would consume food faster than it could fight. They understood that mobility and sustainability mattered as much as raw numbers. This wasn't a disorganized, barbarian horde. This was a confederation attempting to fight Rome using organizational principles that Rome itself would recognize. In late September or early October, Caesar doesn't provide specific calendar dates, The relief army reached Alesia. From their camps on hills less than a mile from the Roman circumvallation, the warriors could see the plateau of Montauxois, where Vercingetorix's force waited. They could see the massive circuit of Roman fortifications, and they could begin planning how to break through 40 kilometers of walls, ditches, and obstacles to rescue their besieged comrades. Inside Alesia, starving defenders saw the relief army arrive and understood they had one last chance. The coordinated assault would come soon. Vercingetorix would attack the inner fortifications while the relief force struck the outer walls. Somewhere in that massive circuit, the Romans would break. They had to break. The alternative was the death of Gallic independence. On the Roman walls, legionaries sharpened their swords and tested their artillery. They were outnumbered at least 3-1, possibly 5-1. They were defending 40 kilometers of fortifications against simultaneous attack from both sides. By every conventional measure, their position was impossible. But Caesar had built his career on making the impossible work. The first test came at noon, on a day that would see 10,000 cavalry clash on the plains of Les Lomes, while 80,000 trapped warriors watched from the heights and wondered if rescue would arrive in time. Historical sources record that the first major engagement began around midday and continued until sunset, approximately 6 hours of continuous combat on the flat plains west of Alesia. The Gallic relief army deployed its full cavalry force of 8,000 mounted warriors supported by light infantry archers and skirmishers. This combined arms approach represented tactical evolution from earlier defeats. The Gauls had learned that cavalry needed infantry support in close combat. Caesar's account describes the Roman response with tactical detail that suggests he was observing from an elevated command post where he could see the entire plain. The Roman and Germanic auxiliary cavalry deployed to meet the threat. What followed was the largest cavalry engagement of the Gallic Wars. And the outcome would determine whether the relief army could maintain mobility or would be forced into static siege warfare. The Gallic cavalry tactics showed sophistication that had been absent earlier in the war. Light infantry archers ran alongside the mounted warriors, providing covering fire during charges and supporting the cavalry in melee combat. When Roman horsemen engaged Gallic riders, the archers targeted them from short range. When Roman formations tried to maneuver, the light infantry blocked gaps and prevented exploitation. Caesar notes this tactic caused his cavalry _0_, a rare admission of tactical difficulty in his normally confident commentaries. For several hours, the battle across the 3-mile plain was evenly matched. Neither side could gain decisive advantage. Roman cavalry pushed forward, Gallic cavalry countered. The Iaduan contingent, fighting for Vercingetorix despite their tribe's historical alliance with Rome, showed particular aggression. Their commander, Avaricum, one of the relief army's 4 generals, personally led charges against Roman positions. Inside Alesia, 80,000 warriors crowded the walls facing the plain. They could see their relief force engaging the Romans. They could hear the clash of cavalry across the valley. They cheered when Gallic formations pushed Romans back, fell silent when Roman countercharges disrupted Gallic lines. Their entire hope rested on the cavalry battle's outcome. If the relief army could break Roman cavalry, they could threaten Caesar's siege lines and coordinate with a breakout from Alesia. Caesar recognized the crisis point when his cavalry began giving ground under the combined pressure of Gallic horse and light infantry. Historical sources document his decision: commit the Germanic cavalry reserve. These auxiliary warriors from tribes east of the Rhine fought with tactics foreign to Gallic warfare. They used heavier horses, fought in tighter formations, and specialized in shock charges, massed attacks at full gallop designed to break enemy lines through sheer impact. The Germanic charge hit the Gallic cavalry's flank with what ancient sources describe as great violence. The disciplined formation and heavier mounts broke through the Gallic cavalry screen. Once the mounted warriors scattered, the light infantry who had been supporting them were suddenly exposed and vulnerable. Without cavalry protection, these lightly armored skirmishers faced Germanic horsemen in open terrain. A massacre. Contemporary accounts record specific casualties that suggest eyewitness testimony. Cotus, the chief magistrate of the Aedui, was killed in the cavalry battle. Cavarilis, an Aeduan cavalry commander, died fighting. Eporidorix, one of the relief army's 4 supreme commanders, fled the battlefield. He survived, but his command authority was shattered. The specificity of these named casualties argues for the basic accuracy of Caesar's account. He had no reason to invent the deaths of specific enemy commanders when thousands of anonymous warriors could serve the same propaganda purpose. The Gallic cavalry rout was complete. Thousands of warriors fled toward their camps on the hills. The relief army's mobile force, which had been intended to screen infantry movements and coordinate attacks, was shattered as an effective combat unit. The psychological impact was devastating. Inside Alesia, defenders who had cheered at the battle's beginning fell silent as they watched their cavalry flee. The relief army had failed its first major test. As sunset ended the day's fighting, both sides assessed the damage. The Gallic relief force had lost its cavalry advantage and suffered heavy casualties in the rout. But they still had overwhelming infantry strength. The Romans had won the day's engagement, but faced the certainty that the relief army wouldn't quit after one defeat. More sophisticated tactics would be needed to break through 40 kilometers of fortifications. That night, in the relief army's camps, the 4 commanders debated their next approach. Daylight cavalry battles favored the Romans. But what about darkness? Could a night assault negate some of Rome's tactical advantages? Could surprise and mass succeed where cavalry had failed? The decision they made would test Caesar's automated defenses in ways that would haunt Gallic survivors for the rest of their lives. Ancient sources record the exact timing with specificity that suggests eyewitness accounts. About midnight, the defenders inside Alesia and the relief army outside heard a signal that coordinated the largest night assault of the Gallic wars. Caesar describes it as a sudden great shout. Thousands of warriors raising their voices simultaneously to alert Vercingetorix inside the fortress that the external attack was beginning. The shout defeated the element of surprise, but served a more important purpose: synchronization. In an age before reliable timekeeping or long-range signal systems, coordinated attacks required audible or visible signals. The midnight assault was designed to hit the Roman fortifications from both sides simultaneously. Vercingetorix's 80,000 would sally against the contravallation while the relief army struck the circumvallation. The Romans would be forced to defend 2 fronts across 40 kilometers of walls with insufficient troops to man all positions strongly. The relief army's preparations for the night assault showed organizational capability. They had spent the entire day after the cavalry defeat constructing siege equipment. Scaling ladders of varying lengths to match different sections of fortification, grappling hooks to pull down palisades, fascines, bundles of sticks bound together to throw into ditches and create crossings, and harrows. Hooked poles designed to tear down wooden defenses. These weren't improvised weapons. They were purpose-built siege tools that required planning, material gathering, and skilled construction. When the great shout echoed across the valley at midnight, the assault began with warriors advancing in darkness toward fortifications they could barely see. Contemporary sources describe what happened next, with details that the archaeological record confirms. The stimulus zone was the first obstacle Gallic warriors encountered. and it was completely invisible in darkness. Iron hooks buried in the ground pierced feet through sandals. Warriors stumbled, cried out in pain, alerted others to invisible danger they couldn't see or avoid. The psychological impact of an unseen weapon was profound. Those who made it through the stimulus field encountered the lilies, concealed pits 3 feet deep with fire-hardened stakes at the bottom. In daylight, advancing warriors might notice subtle differences in ground texture or avoid suspicious-looking earth. In midnight darkness, the pits were undetectable until you fell into one. Caesar records that many were impaled on these obstacles. The cries of wounded men created chaos and terror among warriors advancing behind them. The Sippi, interlocked sharpened branches, created a barrier that couldn't be crossed quickly, even in daylight. In darkness, they became nearly impassable. Warriors trying to climb over them became entangled in sharpened points, presenting stationary targets for Roman artillery firing from the watchtowers. Roman response systems activated exactly as Caesar had designed them. The midnight shout triggered trumpet alarms from watchtowers along the entire circuit. Cohorts rushed to assigned positions based on prepared defense plans. Commanders, Marcus Antonius, Gaius Trebonius, others whose names Caesar records, moved to threaten sectors. Artillery crews began firing scorpions and ballistae from the watchtowers. The bolts and stones weren't aimed at specific targets in the darkness. They were fired toward the sounds of Gallic warriors struggling through the obstacle zones, area suppression designed to inflict random casualties and create terror. Roman soldiers lit torches and positioned them to illuminate the killing zones. The contrast between lit areas and darkness beyond created visibility for defenders while blinding attackers. Gallic warriors advancing toward the walls found themselves silhouetted against torchlight, while Roman legionaries remained in protective darkness behind their ramparts. The two-front assault placed maximum pressure on Roman defenses. Vercingetorix's 80,000 attacked from inside Alesia, attempting to breach the contravallation with the same siege equipment the relief army was using against the outer walls. Roman forces had to shift cohorts from quiet sectors to threatened points. But with 40 kilometers of fortifications, could become crisis points, without warning if the Gauls achieved breakthrough anywhere. For hours, Caesar doesn't specify exactly how long, the night assault continued. Gallic warriors struggled through obstacles, attempted to scale walls, fought hand-to-hand with Roman defenders where they reached the ramparts. Casualties mounted on both sides, though Caesar provides no specific numbers beyond many were killed or wounded. The obstacles did their work. The automated defenses that required no soldiers to operate slowed the assault, channeled attackers into killing zones, and inflicted casualties that weakened subsequent waves. As dawn approached, the Gallic commanders recognized that the night assault had failed to achieve breakthrough. Worse, continuing into daylight would expose their warriors to coordinated Roman counterattacks. The order to withdraw was given before full sunrise. The relief army pulled back to their camps. Vercingetorix's forces retreated into Alesia. The Romans held their fortifications intact. The morning light revealed the cost of the night fighting. Bodies of Gallic warriors lay scattered through the obstacle zones, some impaled on lily stakes, some with feet pierced by stimuli, some tangled in Sippi branches. The automated defenses had functioned exactly as designed, killing and wounding without requiring Roman soldiers to expose themselves to danger. In the relief army's camps, the four commanders faced a deteriorating situation. The cavalry battle had failed. The night assault had failed. Two major efforts had been thrown against Caesar's fortifications without success. But intelligence from scouts who had surveyed the entire Roman circuit brought new information. There was a weakness. on the northern slopes. A hill called Mont Rea was too large for the Romans to enclose completely. The fortifications on that sector had a gap, and attacking from higher ground would reverse the terrain advantage that had favored Rome in the previous assaults. The third attack would be different. It would be coordinated, massive, and aimed at the one point where Roman engineering had been defeated by geography. 60,000 of the relief army's best warriors were selected for the assault, and leading them would be Vercingetorix, Vercingetorix's own cousin, fighting to rescue his kinsman from the trap that was slowly starving him to death. Gallic scouts had spent the morning after the failed night assault conducting systematic reconnaissance of the entire Roman fortification circuit. Contemporary sources document what they found. The North Hill, known today as Mont Rea, presented a topographical challenge that Caesar's engineers couldn't overcome. The hill was simply too large to enclose within the circumvallation. Roman fortifications on the northern slope left a gap where the circuit couldn't connect, and a Roman camp positioned on the hillside was exposed to attack from higher ground. This was the vulnerability the relief army had been searching for. Every previous assault had involved Gallic warriors attacking uphill against Roman positions. At the North Hill, the geography reversed. Gallic forces could attack downhill from the heights, while Roman defenders fought from a disadvantaged position. The four supreme commanders of the relief force recognized this as their best opportunity and assigned the assault to their most capable leader with the highest stakes in victory. Vercingetorix was Vercingetorix's cousin, an Arvernian noble who had led tribal contingents throughout the campaign. Ancient sources identify him as one of the four supreme commanders of the relief army, which suggests he had significant military reputation before Alesia. The decision to give him command of the North Hill assault recognized both his capability and his personal investment in the battle's outcome. He was fighting to rescue his own kinsman. The force assigned to Vercingetorix numbered 60,000 warriors. Elite troops selected from the best fighters in the relief army. This represented roughly half the total relief force by conservative estimates, or a quarter if Caesar's higher numbers were accurate. Either way, it was a massive commitment of resources to a single assault. The scale demonstrates how critical the relief commanders considered this attack. Historical records document the approach with tactical detail. Vercingetorix's force departed their camps at nightfall, moving under cover of darkness to avoid Roman detection. They circled wide around the Roman positions, using valleys and forests to mask their movement. By dawn, they were concealed in the terrain behind the North Hill, invisible to Roman sentries. They remained hidden through the morning, waiting for the signal that would launch the coordinated three-point assault. The battle plan was sophisticated enough that modern military historians recognize it as the most tactically complex operation Gallic forces attempted during the entire war. At noon, 3 attacks would begin simultaneously. Vercingetorix would lead 60,000 warriors down the North Hill against the exposed Roman camp. The main relief army on the plains would assault the circumvallation with remaining forces. Vercingetorix would sally from Alesia with his 80,000, attacking the contravallation. The Romans would face assaults from 3 directions with insufficient forces to defend all points strongly. Defending the North Hill position was Titus Labienus, Caesar's most trusted subordinate and arguably the second-best general in the Roman army. He commanded 6 cohorts, approximately 3,000 men, against 60,000 attackers coming downhill. The numerical disadvantage was roughly 20-1. Labienus's orders from Caesar, as recorded in ancient sources, were brutally simple. Hold the position if possible, and if the lines break, gather your cohorts and charge, rather than die passively in the fortifications. At noon on that autumn day, trumpet signals sounded across the entire battlefield. The three-pronged assault began. Vercingetorix's 60,000 emerged from their concealment behind the North Hill and descended like an avalanche toward the Roman camp. The main relief army on the plains launched their assault against the outer walls. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's 80,000 attacked the inner fortifications at every accessible point. For the first time since the siege began, the Romans were fighting simultaneously on all fronts with the enemy coordinating movements. The tactical situation that Caesar had created by trapping himself between two armies had become reality. If breakthrough occurred at any point, the entire Roman position would collapse. The siege works that had seemed so formidable when being constructed were about to face their ultimate test. And on the North Hill, where terrain favored the attackers and numbers were most dramatically unbalanced, Titus Labienus and 3,000 Roman legionaries prepared to face 20 times their number descending from higher ground with a full weight of Gallic fury behind them. Contemporary sources describe the crisis at the North Hill with details suggesting eyewitness accounts from multiple perspectives. Vercingetorix's 60,000 warriors came down the slope using siege equipment prepared specifically for this assault. They carried harrows, hooked poles designed to tear down wooden palisades, and fascines to fill ditches. They used the weight of their numbers and momentum of downhill attack to push against fortifications that weren't designed to withstand this kind of pressure. Labienus's 3,000 fought with the desperation of men who understood the mathematics. If the North Hill position broke, the entire siege would unravel. Roman cohorts maintained their positions on the ramparts, throwing pila into the packed Gallic ranks. But sheer numbers were overwhelming the defenses. Ancient accounts record that the Gauls were literally pulling down sections of the Roman palisade with their harrows, while others filled ditches to create crossings for the mass of warriors behind them. Caesar, observing from his command post where he could see the entire battlefield, recognized the critical moment. Historical sources document his decision with specific tactical detail. He sent reinforcements, exact numbers unspecified, toward the North Hill with orders for Labienus. But reinforcements alone wouldn't be enough. The Gallic assault had too much momentum. What was needed was a psychological shock that would break the attack's cohesion. Caesar made a personal decision that ancient writers emphasize because it fit Roman ideals of leadership. He personally led cohorts toward the North Hill crisis point. Plutarch and later sources note what made him instantly recognizable: his scarlet paludamentum, the general's cloak that distinguished him from every other soldier on the battlefield. Roman military culture expected commanders to demonstrate courage by exposing themselves to danger. Caesar took this principle and used it as psychological warfare. The sight of the scarlet cloak moving toward the crisis point had documented effect on Roman morale. Caesar himself records that every man exerted himself to the utmost when they saw their general entering the fight. This is self-promotion, Caesar writing his own heroic narrative. But it's consistent with Roman military culture where personal courage from commanders inspired soldiers to greater efforts. The psychological impact of leadership presence in ancient warfare was real and tactically significant. But Caesar's visible advance was only one element of his response. While personally leading cohorts forward in what appeared to be a desperate reinforcement, he was simultaneously executing a flanking maneuver that would decide the battle. He ordered several cohorts of cavalry, sources don't specify exactly how many, to leave the fortifications, circle wide around the back of the North Hill, and attack Vercingetorix's force from the rear. This was classic Roman exploitation of interior lines. Because the Roman fortifications formed a circle, forces could move along shorter interior paths while enemies had to travel longer exterior routes. Cavalry sent around the North Hill could reach Vercingetorix's rear faster than Gallic warriors could respond to the threat, because the Romans were traveling inside the circle while the Gauls were positioned on its exterior. Contemporary accounts describe the convergence with the kind of detail that suggests multiple sources were later interviewed about this climactic moment. Labienus, following Caesar's orders, gathered his cohorts and launched a countercharge down from the ramparts with swords drawn. This was the charge rather than die passively option Caesar had authorized. Caesar's personally led cohorts struck Vercingetorix's flank, and the cavalry that had circled the North Hill emerged behind the Gallic force, attacking the rear. 60,000 elite warriors found themselves trapped between three Roman forces. The downhill advantage they had exploited became a trap. Warriors at the front of the assault couldn't retreat because warriors behind them were still advancing. Warriors at the rear couldn't advance because cavalry was cutting them down from behind. The formation that had been a coordinated assault became a mob. The slaughter that followed is documented with specific details that argue for historical accuracy. Vercingetorix was captured alive, a detail too specific and too potentially verifiable to be invented propaganda. 74 Gallic military standards were taken, a precise number that suggests actual counting of captured tribal symbols. Ancient sources record that very few of that number escaped, which, given the encirclement and chaos, probably indicates catastrophic casualties. The exact death toll from the North Hill battle is unknowable. Ancient sources don't provide specific casualty counts, and modern historians can only estimate based on the tactical situation. But if Vercingetorix commanded 60,000 warriors and quote, _9, the losses may have reached tens of thousands. This would make the North Hill engagement one of the bloodiest single encounters of the Gallic Wars. The psychological impact of the North Hill disaster rippled across the entire battlefield immediately. The main relief army on the plains could see what was happening to their elite force. They watched almost 60,000 of their best warriors disappear into Roman encirclement. They saw the tribal standards captured. They understood that the most powerful assault the Confederation could mount had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Contemporary sources record the chain reaction with language suggesting eyewitness observation. The relief army on the plains quote, _10 units that had been assaulting the circumvallation began withdrawing. The withdrawal became disorganized. Tribal contingents started breaking off to return to their home territories. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw the relief army retreating and ordered his own assault stopped. There was no point in throwing away lives when the rescue attempt had failed. The Battle of Alesia's third day had decided the siege. The relief army was scattering. Vercingetorix was trapped with no hope of external rescue. And across the North Hill slope, the bodies of tens of thousands of Gallic warriors marked where the Confederation's greatest effort had broken against Roman engineering, discipline, and tactical flexibility. What remained was pursuit, surrender, and the terrible accounting of what defeat meant in ancient warfare. Historical sources describe the disintegration of the relief army, with details suggesting the chaos was visible from multiple vantage points. The destruction of Vercingetorix's elite force on the North Hill triggered psychological collapse across the entire Gallic Confederation. Warriors who had marched to Alesia believing they were rescuing Vercingetorix now understood they were watching the destruction of Gallic military power. The relief army's withdrawal from the circumvallation assault turned into uncoordinated retreat as news of the North Hill disaster spread. Tribal contingents, which had always maintained some independent identity, even under the Confederation's unified command, began making individual decisions about whether to continue fighting. The Aedui pulled back, The Arverni withdrew. The Sequani departed. What had been a coordinated military force fractured into dozens of separate tribal groups, each heading toward their home territories. Caesar ordered immediate pursuit. Roman and Germanic cavalry, fresh from their flanking maneuver at the North Hill, were unleashed to chase down retreating Gallic warriors. Ancient sources record that the pursuit continued until nightfall, suggesting several hours of running combat as cavalry cut down fleeing infantry. The casualties from this pursuit phase were described as great numbers slain, but no specific count is provided. Roman practice in pursuit was to kill as many as possible while preventing regrouping and capturing those too exhausted to escape. The pursuit served strategic purpose beyond immediate casualties. Every Gallic warrior who made it home would tell stories of the disaster at Alesia. The psychological impact of catastrophic defeat would spread across Gaul faster than Roman legions could march. Tribes that might have considered continued resistance would reconsider after hearing from survivors about the slaughter on the North Hill and the rout that followed. Inside Alesia, 80,000 warriors watched the relief army disappear into the countryside. The noise of battle on the plains faded. The sounds of pursuit grew distant and then stopped. By evening, the battlefield was silent, except for the cries of wounded men scattered across the slopes and plains. Vercingetorix convened his final council of war, knowing that every option was terrible, and only some were survivable. The morning after the battle revealed the scale of destruction in physical terms. The slopes of the North Hill were littered with Gallic dead. Contemporary sources don't provide exact body counts, but the density of casualties in an area where 60,000 warriors were encircled and destroyed must have created scenes that shocked even veteran Roman soldiers accustomed to battlefield carnage. The tribal standards that had been captured, 74 of them, represented not just military defeats, but the symbolic destruction of tribal identity and honor. The abandoned equipment told its own story. The relief army had fled so quickly that siege engines, scaling ladders, and supplies for what had been intended as a sustained campaign were left behind. Caesar's account mentions this abandonment as evidence of panic, and the archaeological record confirms that large quantities of military equipment were lost. For the Romans, this represented valuable salvage. For the Gauls, it represented months of preparation wasted in hours of defeat. The horses added another dimension to the horror. Ancient sources record that hundreds of cavalry mounts wandered the battlefield, some refusing to leave their dead riders. Modern estimates based on the cavalry engagement scale suggest nearly 400 horses were lost. Animals that represented years of breeding and training, now dead or captured. In an agricultural society where horses were valuable military and economic assets, these losses hurt beyond their immediate tactical impact. The casualty estimates from the entire three-day battle remain disputed among historians. Caesar provides specific numbers for some engagements. The 74 standards captured, the named commanders killed, but doesn't give comprehensive death tolls. Modern historians, analyzing the tactical situations and calculating based on the forces engaged, estimate total Gallic casualties from the siege at somewhere between 80,000 and 130,000 killed, wounded, or captured. These calculations are necessarily imprecise, but even the conservative estimates represent catastrophic losses for the Gallic Confederation. Roman casualties went unrecorded in Caesar's account, following his standard practice of minimizing or ignoring his own side's losses. Based on defensive siege warfare typically favoring defenders and the fact that Romans fought largely from fortified positions, modern estimates suggest Roman casualties were probably in the range of 3,000 to 5,000 killed and wounded. The casualty ratio, approximately 30 to 40 Gallic deaths for every Roman death, reflects the enormous advantage that engineering and fortifications provided. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix faced the mathematics of defeat. 80,000 starving warriors. No relief force coming. No possibility of breakout through intact Roman fortifications. No food remaining. The choices were simple. Die fighting in a suicidal assault, die slowly from starvation, or surrender and face whatever fate Caesar imposed. The council that Vercingetorix convened produced the decision that ancient sources record with varying detail but consistent conclusion. The young commander who had united Gaul implemented brilliant scorched earth strategy and fought Rome to a standstill for months, offered himself as sacrifice to save his warriors. The historical record preserves two significantly different accounts of Vercingetorix's surrender, and the contrast between them reveals how the same event can be remembered differently depending on who's telling the story. Caesar's own commentaries describe the surrender with businesslike brevity that spans 3 sentences. Arms were ordered delivered. The tribal chiefs were brought before him. Vercingetorix was handed over. That's the complete account from the man who was there and who wrote about it within a year or two of the events. But Plutarch, writing his biographical work on Caesar approximately 150 years later, preserves a dramatically different tradition. According to Plutarch's account, Vercingetorix put on his most beautiful armor and caparisoned his horse with full ceremonial gear. He rode out through Alesia's gates and approached Caesar's tribunal. He rode in a complete circle around the seated Roman commander. Then he dismounted, removed his armor piece by piece, and sat down at Caesar's feet. He remained there in complete silence until Caesar ordered him taken away to await his triumph in Rome. Modern historians generally give more credence to Plutarch's dramatic version than to Caesar's minimal account, and the reasoning reveals how we evaluate ancient sources. Caesar wrote propaganda to justify his wars to Rome and to enhance his own reputation. Minimizing Vercingetorix's importance served that purpose. The young Gallic commander was just another defeated enemy, not worth extended description. Plutarch, however, wrote biography focused on character and dramatic moments. He used sources now lost to us, including the memoirs of Asinius Pollio, who served under Caesar in Gaul and was present at Alesia. Pollio's lost history is known to have been more critical of Caesar than Caesar was of himself. The surrender ritual Plutarch describes also fits documented Celtic warrior culture. The ritual circle on horseback, the symbolic disarmament, the silent submission. These elements appear in other accounts of Celtic surrender ceremonies documented in archaeological and literary sources. Caesar had reason to downplay such theater. Later sources drawing on eyewitness accounts had reason to preserve it. Whether the surrender was minimal or theatrical, the immediate practical consequences were identical and are documented with certainty. 80,000 Gallic warriors were distributed as slaves. This wasn't casual enslavement. This was systematic distribution of human beings as property following Roman military custom. Each Roman soldier in Caesar's army received 1 Gallic warrior as personal property. With approximately 50,000 Roman soldiers at Alesia, this accounts for about 50,000 of the captured warriors. The remaining 30,000 were excess inventory whose fate the sources don't specify, probably sold at Roman slave markets or distributed as bonuses to officers. The economic calculations are staggering. Based on documented Roman slave market prices from this period, ordinary war captives typically sold for 200 to 500 denarii each, depending on age, health, and skills, at an average of 300 denarii per captive. 80,000 enslaved Gauls represented approximately 24 million denarii in value. wealth roughly equivalent to Caesar's entire debt that had driven him to Gaul in the first place. The soldiers who received these captives could sell them immediately at markets that sprang up wherever Roman armies campaigned, converting human beings into cash that represented months or years of military pay. But two categories of prisoners received different treatment, and the exceptions reveal political calculation alongside military victory. The Aedui captives were returned to their tribe without enslavement. The Arverni captives were similarly released. Caesar's reasoning, which he doesn't state explicitly, but which is obvious from context, was purely political. The Aedui had been Rome's traditional allies before their defection in 52 BC. Returning their warriors was an olive branch designed to restore the alliance. The Arverni were Vercingetorix's own tribe. Showing them clemency encouraged other tribes to submit peacefully rather than face the same total defeat as Alesia. Vercingetorix himself faced a fate reserved for important enemy commanders. He was placed in chains and held for Caesar's eventual triumph in Rome. Roman triumphal tradition required that defeated enemy leaders be paraded through Rome's streets, then ritually executed after the celebration. Vercingetorix would spend the next 6 years imprisoned in the Tullianum, Rome's underground prison carved into bedrock beneath the Capitoline Hill. The cell was dark, damp, and designed for short-term detention before execution. That Vercingetorix survived 6 years in such conditions speaks to either Caesar's political calculations about timing his triumph or simple administrative neglect. In 46 BC, Caesar finally celebrated his Gallic triumph. Ancient sources describe Vercingetorix being paraded through Rome's streets before massive crowds who came to see the defeated Gallic king. After the procession, following tradition that reached back to the earliest days of the Republic, Vercingetorix was taken back to the Tullianum and strangled. He was approximately 36 years old. The young man who had united Gaul, implemented scorched earth strategy, and nearly defeated Rome's greatest general died alone in a Roman dungeon because his final gamble at Alesia had failed. The 74 captured tribal standards were displayed in Caesar's triumph, tangible symbols of the Confederation's destruction. The Aedui and Arverni, released from captivity, returned home to submit formally to Roman authority. The tribes that had sent warriors to the relief army, most of them had watched those warriors die or be enslaved, made their own calculations about whether continued resistance was possible or suicidal. But the fate of the 80,000 enslaved warriors tells us what Roman conquest actually meant in human terms, beyond the battles and sieges that ancient sources emphasized. The distribution of 80,000 human beings as property following Alesia represents one of the largest single enslavements in ancient history. And the scale allows historians to calculate the economic impact with unusual precision. Each Roman soldier who fought in the siege received one Gallic warrior as personal property. This wasn't abstract wealth. This was a human being whose labor value could be immediately converted to cash at the slave markets that followed Roman armies. Historical research on Roman slavery economics documents the typical prices for war captives in this period. Young, healthy males suitable for agricultural labor sold for approximately 200 to 300 denarii. Skilled craftsmen or educated captives commanded higher prices, up to 500 denarii or more. Taking a conservative average of 250 denarii per captive, 80,000 enslaved Gauls represented a total value of approximately 20 million denarii. This was wealth that transformed soldiers' lives. A legionary's base pay was approximately 225 denarii per year. Selling a single enslaved captive could represent a full year's pay or more. What happened to these 80,000 men? The sources don't preserve individual stories, but historical research on Roman slavery provides the broader patterns. The majority ended up in agricultural labor on Italian estates. Rome's conquest of the Mediterranean had created enormous agricultural properties worked by slave labor, and there was constant demand for new workers to replace those who died from harsh conditions, disease, or exhaustion. Gallic warriors who had fought with shields and spears found themselves harvesting grain or tending olive groves under conditions that killed many within a few years. Mining represented another destination for enslaved war captives, particularly those considered dangerous or rebellious. Roman mines in Spain, Sicily, and elsewhere consumed slaves at horrific rates. Working conditions in ancient mines were brutal enough that assignment to mining was essentially a death sentence. How many of Alesia's warriors ended up in mines is unknowable, but the pattern was common enough that some certainly did. Domestic service absorbed younger and more educated captives. Roman aristocratic households employed dozens or hundreds of slaves for everything from cooking to tutoring children. Gallic warriors who spoke Latin or had useful skills might find themselves in households rather than fields. Their conditions were generally better than agricultural or mining slaves, and domestic slaves had higher chances of eventual manumission. Formal freedom granted by owners. Gladiatorial training was rare, but documented. Some enslaved warriors with combat experience were selected for gladiator schools, where they would be trained to fight in the arenas that Romans built across their empire. Successful gladiators could eventually earn freedom and wealth, but most died in the arena within a few years. The number of Alesia's warriors who became gladiators was probably small, perhaps hundreds rather than thousands. But for those selected, it represented a path back to combat, albeit in very different circumstances than they'd known in Gaul. The geographic dispersal of 80,000 men across the Roman world had demographic consequences for the Gallic tribes they'd come from. These weren't random citizens. These were military-age males, the warriors who would have defended their communities and participated in tribal politics. Removing 80,000 such men from Gallic society in a single event created population impacts that accelerated the collapse of organized resistance. Tribes that sent thousands of warriors to the relief army at Alesia simply couldn't field comparable forces again. The exceptions, the Aedui and Arverni warriors who were returned, create interesting contrast. These tribes received back thousands of experienced warriors who had witnessed the destruction of the Confederation at Alesia. They had watched the relief army scatter. They had seen 60,000 elite troops destroyed at the North Hill. They returned to their tribes as walking lessons in the futility of resisting Rome. Caesar's clemency wasn't mercy. It was strategic deployment of eyewitnesses to Roman military power. For the warriors who were enslaved, Roman legal traditions offered some possibility of eventual freedom. Manumission was common enough in Roman society that some enslaved people gained freedom after years of service. Children born to enslaved people could sometimes be freed by owners. Over generations, some descendants of Alesia's enslaved warriors probably integrated into Roman society as freed people or their descendants. But for the 80,000 men who were distributed as property in 52 BC, freedom was probably a distant hope that most never saw realized. The human cost of Alesia goes beyond the battlefield casualties. The warriors who died at the North Hill or in the rout at least died as warriors. The 80,000 who survived to be enslaved faced decades of forced labor under conditions that killed many and broke others. Ancient sources don't record their voices, their experiences, or their individual fates. They exist in the historical record only as numbers in Caesar's dispatches and property in Roman ledgers. But their enslavement had strategic consequences that shaped how the rest of Gaul responded to Roman conquest. The immediate aftermath of Alesia saw the rapid collapse of organized Gallic resistance with a speed that surprised even Caesar. Within months of Vercingetorix's surrender, tribal delegations from across Gaul approached Roman camps offering submission. The confederation that Vercingetorix had built disintegrated as quickly as it had formed. Historical sources document the tribal submissions continuing through late 52 BC and into 51 BC, each tribe making the calculation that resistance after Alesia was suicide. The final act of the Gallic Wars came at Uxellodunum in 51 BC, where holdouts continued resisting Roman authority. Caesar's response demonstrated how Alesia had transformed the strategic situation. He didn't need to destroy every fortified position in Gaul anymore. He needed to make an example brutal enough that no other tribe would dare resist. Ancient sources record that after Uxellodunum surrendered, Caesar ordered the right hands of every defender amputated. Thousands of Gallic warriors were deliberately crippled and sent back to their tribes as walking advertisements for the cost of continued resistance. By 50 BC, organized military opposition to Roman conquest had ended. The wealth and veteran soldiers that Gallic conquest provided Caesar became the foundation for his next war, the one against Rome itself. In 50 BC, the Senate demanded that Caesar disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. This would have meant losing his proconsular immunity and facing prosecution from political enemies. Caesar's response in 49 BC was to cross the Rubicon River with his army, initiating the civil war that destroyed the Roman Republic and paved the way for the empire. The causal chain from Alesia to the Roman Empire is historically documented. Caesar's wealth from Gallic plunder let him maintain political support in Rome while absent on campaign. His veteran legions from 8 years of Gallic warfare were personally loyal to him rather than to the Senate. When civil war came, these veterans formed the core of the army that defeated Pompey at Pharsalus in 48 BC. Without the resources and military power that Gallic conquest provided, Caesar couldn't have challenged the Senate successfully. Without Alesia, the conquest of Gaul might have dragged on for years or failed entirely. The fortifications Caesar built around that hilltop in Burgundy helped determine the future structure of Western civilization. For Gaul itself, Alesia marked the end of Celtic political independence and the beginning of transformation into Gallo-Roman civilization. The change didn't happen overnight, but Roman occupation fundamentally altered Gallic society over the following centuries. Latin replaced Gallic languages as the primary tongue. Modern French evolved from the Latin spoken in Roman Gaul, not from Celtic languages that were already dying out by the 3rd century AD. Druidism, the Celtic religious practice that had unified Gallic culture, was systematically suppressed. Human sacrifice, which had been part of Druidic ritual, was outlawed. Roman urban culture replaced tribal social structures. Archaeological evidence documents the transformation. Roman cities rose across Gaul. Lugdunum became modern Lyon. Lutetia expanded into Paris. Augustodunum was built as Autumn. Roman roads connected these urban centers, some still forming the basis of French highway routes today. Aqueducts brought water to cities. Roman baths, forums, amphitheaters, and theaters were built across the territory. Within a century of Alesia, Gaul had become one of the wealthiest Roman provinces, producing grain, wine, metalwork, and manufactured goods that were traded across the Mediterranean. The economic integration brought prosperity, but erased independence. Gallic tribes that had fiercely defended their autonomy became administrative districts in the Roman provincial system. Tribal aristocracies that had led warriors to Alesia were transformed into Romanized provincial elites who spoke Latin, wore togas, and sent their children to be educated in Rome. Some prospered under Roman rule, The Aedui, for instance, leveraged their restored alliance to gain significant administrative positions. But the Celtic culture they had known was methodically replaced by Roman culture over generations. Military historians still study Alesia because the engineering principles Caesar demonstrated remain valid. The concept of defense in depth, multiple layers of obstacles creating zones that slow and disorganize attackers, appears in modern fortification design. The use of force multipliers, defensive systems that increase combat power without requiring additional troops, remains fundamental to military thinking. The automated obstacles that Caesar built, stimuli, lilies, Scipi, are ancient ancestors of modern landmines and anti-personnel systems. The double circumvallation that deliberately trapped the besiegers to trap the besieged represents audacious strategic thinking that still features in military academy case studies. The archaeological vindication of Caesar's account represents historical verification on a scale rarely seen for ancient battles. The excavations at Alesia in the 1860s under Napoleon III and the comprehensive Franco-German project in the 1990s confirmed details that seemed too precise to be believable. The ditches were where Caesar said they were, with the dimensions he specified. The tower foundations appeared at 80-foot intervals as documented. The lily pits existed in quincunx patterns, exactly as described. The level of archaeological confirmation for a battle fought 2,000 years ago is extraordinary and validates treating Caesar's engineering descriptions as reliable technical documentation, even when we question his propaganda claims. The long-term consequences reach into the present. Modern France exists as a culturally unified nation, partly because Roman conquest created administrative and linguistic unity, where Celtic tribal divisions had created fragmentation. The Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, all evolved from Latin and wouldn't exist if Roman conquest hadn't spread Latin across the empire. Christianity, which would become Europe's defining religion, spread through Latin-speaking provinces like Gaul rather than through Celtic-speaking independent territories. The legal systems, urban planning traditions, and political concepts that shaped medieval and modern Europe all trace roots to Roman civilization that replaced Celtic culture after Alesia. But there's a final irony in Alesia's historical impact that reveals the complex relationship between military victory and political consequence. Caesar's brilliant engineering triumph made him too powerful for the Republic to tolerate. 8 years after Alesia, in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated by senators who feared exactly what Alesia had helped create. A general with an army more loyal to him than to Rome. The Republic Caesar claimed to serve died partly because his victories made Republican government obsolete. Vercingetorix died in chains. But Caesar's victory ultimately killed the political system it was supposed to defend. Both sides lost at Alesia in ways neither could have predicted on that autumn day in 52 BC, when the impossible mathematics of siege warfare were resolved through engineering genius and ruthless determination in the frozen hills of Burgundy in 52 BC. Documented historical records show us something that still defies belief, even after archaeological confirmation. 50,000 Romans defeated forces totaling somewhere between 180,000 and 330,000 Gauls. The exact ratio depends on which ancient source you trust, but even conservative modern estimates put the numerical disadvantage at least 3 to 1. They didn't defeat these overwhelming numbers through superior weapons or more heroic courage. They defeated them through engineering. The archaeological evidence preserves the method. 40 kilometers of fortifications, 3-layer obstacle systems confirmed in precise detail by excavations 2,000 years later. Automated defenses that worked without soldiers operating them. watchtowers spaced at 80-foot intervals, providing overlapping artillery coverage. The V-shaped ditches, the quincunx pattern lily pits, the buried iron goads, physical evidence of ancient military engineering that was so effective, it became the textbook example for 2 millennia of subsequent warfare. Military historians still debate Alesia because the principles transcend the specific ancient context. Force multipliers using terrain and engineering to multiply combat effectiveness. Defense in depth, creating multiple killing zones that exhaust attackers. Interior lines, allowing defenders to move forces more quickly than exterior attackers. Psychological warfare, making the enemy's own fear and uncertainty into weapons. These concepts appear in modern defensive doctrine because they're fundamentally sound regardless of technological era. The human cost demands acknowledgement even as we analyze the tactical brilliance. 80,000 warriors enslaved in a single day. Tens of thousands killed across 3 days of coordinated battle. The Mandubi civilians who starved in no man's land between armies that both refused them mercy. The 60,000 elite troops encircled and destroyed at the North Hill. Celtic culture, languages, and religious practices systematically erased over subsequent centuries of Romanization. The voices of the defeated aren't preserved in sources written by victors, but their silence in the historical record doesn't make their experiences less real or their losses less profound. Vercingetorix became a symbol of French resistance against foreign conquest in the 19th century, when nationalism needed ancient heroes. But the Gauls he led weren't French. They were Celts, fighting to preserve a world that Caesar's victory destroyed. The nation that celebrates him exists because Rome won, not because Gaul resisted. Modern France is fundamentally Roman in language, legal tradition, urban culture, and administrative structure. The Celtic civilization that Vercingetorix defended disappeared so thoroughly that we know it primarily through Roman sources describing the people they conquered. Caesar's engineering brilliance at Alesia made him too powerful for the Republic to control. 8 years after his greatest victory, senators who feared military dictatorship assassinated him in the Senate chamber. But the Republic died anyway, because Caesar's conquests had demonstrated that military power could override constitutional authority. The empire that followed, formally established by Caesar's adopted son Augustus in 27 BC, was built partly on the wealth and veteran legions that Gallic conquest provided. The walls Caesar built around Alesia were supposed to save the Republic. Instead, they helped bury it under the imperial system it became. You can visit Alesia today. The Muséoparc at Alesia-Saint-Reine preserves artifacts from the battle and provides interpretation of the siege. The ditches Caesar's engineers dug 2,000 years ago are still traceable in aerial photography. The plateau where Vercingetorix made his stand overlooks valleys where 80,000 warriors watched their relief force arrive and then watched it die. A statue of Vercingetorix, erected by Napoleon III in the 1860s, stands on Mont Auxois, looking out over the battlefield where the last great Celtic resistance to Rome was broken by engineering, discipline, and one general's willingness to trap himself in order to trap his enemy. The siege lasted approximately 6 weeks from initial investment to final surrender. 3 days of main battle decided the outcome, and 2,000 years of European history were shaped by what happened when impossible mathematics met Roman engineering on a hilltop in Gaul.